kindly stand up for the anthem of the African Union. Thank you very much. You may now be seated. Honorable Mr. Abubakar M. Tambadou, Attorney General and Minister of Justice of the Republic of the Gambia. Honorable Commissioner Lawrence Murugu Mute, Vice Chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Honorable Commissioners, members of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Honorable ministers here present, distinguished dignitaries, members of the Diplomatic and Consular Corps, delegates, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols duly observed. Welcome and thank you all for coming to participate in the closing of the 63rd Ordinary Session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. With your kind permission, I now call upon Honorable Commissioner Lucia Swagbo to read the final communiqué of the 63rd Ordinary Session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Honorable Commissioner, you have the floor, ma'am.
Final communiqué of the 63rd Ordinary Session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights held its 63rd Ordinary Session in Banjul, the Gambia, from the 24th October to 13th November 2018. The Commission celebrated the 70th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on this occasion. The following members of the Commission participated in the session: Honorable Commissioner Soyata Maiga, Chairperson; Honorable Commissioner Lawrence Murugu Mute, Vice Chairperson; Honorable Commissioner Yung Kam John Yung Sik; Honorable Commissioner Kaitesi Zenabu Sylvie; Honorable Commissioner Lucia Swagbo; Honorable Commissioner Maya Sail Fadel; Honorable Commissioner Jamesina A.C.L. King; Honorable Commissioner Solomon Ayele Derso; Honorable Commissioner Hatem SM; Honorable Commissioner Maria Teresa Manuela; and Honorable Commissioner Remy Ngoy Lumbo. The opening ceremony was graced by the presence of His Excellency, Mr. Huzainu Darbo, Vice President of the Republic of the Gambia, who declared the 63rd Ordinary Session open. Mrs. Anna Foster, speaking on behalf of the participants of the NGO Forum, highlighted some of the activities carried out during the forum, including the 37th African Human Rights Book Fair from 20th to 22nd October 2018, celebrations of the African Human Rights Day on the 21st October 2018, and commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the 15th anniversary of the Protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the Rights of Women in Africa. She also indicated that the forum held discussions on preventing corruption within the framework of the African Union theme for 2018, winning the fight against corruption. Mr. Bongani Majula, speaking on behalf of the Network of African Human Rights Institutions, commended the work of the Commission in continuing to uphold a human rights culture in Africa. He cited armed conflicts, terrorism, corruption, migration, and human trafficking as challenges which hinder the realization of human rights targets. Mr. Majula mentioned some of the challenges faced by African national human rights institutions in the independent exercise of their mandates, including budget cuts, irregular appointment and removal of national human rights institution members, verbal attacks on the members, denial of access to state-owned media coverage, denying immunity to NHRI leadership, and delaying consideration of NHIR findings in Parliament. He underscored the importance of strong and independent NHRIs, as they are one of the very few last forms of defense against unchecked state power. He appealed to all the AU and member states to promote and protect the independence of the Commission, as the success of NHIRs depends on the work and leadership provided by the Commission. Speaking on behalf of member states, His Excellency Ambassador Wael Atiyah, Director of Human Rights Department in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Arab Republic of Egypt, recalled the decision of the AU member states to establish the Commission in order to monitor implementation of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and provide technical assistance to member states in the realization of human rights. He stressed the need to take stock of past achievements and rekindled cooperation between the Commission and AU policy organs. In this regard, he recalled a retreat that was held in June 2018 in Nairobi, Kenya, to foster regular consultations between the AU Permanent Representative Committee and the Commission. His Excellency Ambassador Atiyah indicated that it is essential to continue this collaborative effort to enhance the efficiency of the Commission and to enable it to assist member states in fulfilling their human rights obligations. He concluded by stating that Egypt will continue to support the Commission and announced that it will host the 64th Ordinary Session of the Commission. In his statement, Mr. Dominique Delpeuch, speaking on behalf of the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, congratulated the Gambia in joining the OIF in October 2018. He stated that OIF promotes peace, democracy, and human rights in accordance with the Bamako Declaration of 3rd November 2000, which aims to consolidate the rule of law, human rights, and democratic culture. He added that the declaration affirms the need to intensify cooperation between OIF and international and regional organizations. He indicated that it is within this framework that OIF and the Commission recently signed a memorandum of understanding and agreed on a roadmap. Mr. Delpeuch welcomed the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and stated that while progress has been made in the implementation of the declaration, a lot remains to be done. He expressed OIF's concern regarding challenges to the principles of universality and indivisibility of human rights under the guise of the fight against terrorism and migration. Mr. Mohamed Sissiguru, speaking on behalf of Ms. Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, remarked on the AU theme of 2018, winning the fight against corruption, stating that the UN, like the AU, is also concerned about issues of corruption. He recalled the 2012 declaration of the high-level meeting of the General Assembly on the rule of law, which alludes to negative impacts of corruption and stressed the importance of the rule of law in addressing and preventing corruption. Mr. Sissiguru noted that corruption can take many forms and can have individual and collective impacts on the enjoyment of human rights. He expressed his hope that the Addis Ababa Roadmap Agreement will be extended to jointly tackle corruption. He reiterated the Commission's motto, "Human rights, our collective responsibility," and expressed in that regard the support of the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights to the work of the Commission and the AU. Honorable Justice Tujilan Chizumila, speaking on behalf of Justice Sylvain Ore, President of the African Court on Human and People's Rights, noted that after 3 decades of operation, the Commission remains critical to the achievement of the major objectives of the AU. She recalled the decision of the AU and its member states to establish the court in order to complement and strengthen the continued and independent operation of the Commission. She added that the court acknowledged the functional independence of the Commission in the case of Femi Falana against the Commission. Honorable Justice Chizumila shared the concerns of the court regarding the recent misunderstandings on how human rights institutions and organs set up by the AU should discharge their mandates. She stated that the trend is not in line with the commitments and values of the AU and its member states enunciated under the AU Constitutive Act and the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, particularly the rule of law and independence of adjudicatory bodies. She concluded by stating that Africa is a continent of solidarity, which is why the AU created the court but retained the Commission to embed a culture of human rights and justice for all. In her opening statement, the chairperson of the Commission, Honorable Commissioner Suyata Maiga, welcomed participants to the 63rd Ordinary Session of the Commission and expressed her gratitude to the government of the Gambia for facilitating this session. She noted that this year human rights are at the forefront as the entire world commemorates 70 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, an instrument which is the first international articulation of the rights and freedoms of members of the human family. The chairperson proceeded to share some concerns regarding human rights situation on the continent, such as the security situation in the Sahel region and its impact on the rights of populations, the migration crisis in Africa, the population turmoil in Togo, and post-electoral protests in Mali and Cote d'Ivoire, the situation in English-speaking Cameroon, the political crisis in the DRC, particularly attacks on civilians in Benin, the political crisis in Burundi, and the suspension of the activities of all foreign NGOs. the arbitrary arrest and detention of human rights defenders in several African countries, restrictions on freedom of expression and assembly in Cameroon, Gabon, Egypt, DRC, and Sudan. She also noted with concern the adverse impacts of corruption on human rights, particularly with regards to social and economic rights. The chairperson also shared some positive developments in the continent, including the ratification by the Gambia of the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, aiming at the abolition of death penalty, and the establishment of the Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations Commission. The steps taken by the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia to promote peacekeeping, democratic change, and human rights, and the recent establishment of a gender-balanced cabinet, the reconciliation between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and the subsequent opening of borders, the amnesty granted by Ivorian authorities to about 800 individuals, and the political will expressed by the President of Côte d'Ivoire to implement a decision of the African Court. The chairperson remarked on the Executive Council decision of June 2018, reiterating the Commission's firm commitment to the universality of human rights and its commitment to defend the human rights of all persons in accordance with the principles enshrined in the African Charter. She concluded by calling on all stakeholders, including policymakers, to play their role in building democracy, ensuring the rule of law, and promoting and protecting human rights in Africa. Mr. Calix Mbali, speaking on behalf of Mrs. Minata Sabate Sesuma, Commissioner for Political Affairs, noted that the AU human rights system has undergone transformation with the recent adoption of the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the rights of older persons and the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the rights of persons with disabilities in Africa. Mr. Mbari recalled that the AU's decision to declare 2019 as a year of refugees, returnees, and internally displaced persons in Africa towards durable solutions to forced displacement. He emphasized the need to work collectively in the promotion of human rights in Africa and underscored the AU's commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights as elaborated in Agenda 2063. He noted that the AU institutional reform process aims to strengthen the AU human rights institutions, not to weaken them. He called on all stakeholders, including AU member states, civil society, and other actors to engage constructively to realize the aspirations of Agenda 2063. His Excellency, Mr. Uzenu Darbo, Vice President of the Republic of the Gambia, welcomed participants to the 63rd Ordinary Session of the Commission. He indicated that the government of the Gambia is honored to host the sessions of the Commission, particularly the 63rd Ordinary Session, which coincides with the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He noted that African states have taken great strides following the adoption of the Universal Declaration, including the adoption of the African Charter, although more needs to be done to fully realize the values enshrined in the African Charter. The Vice President proceeded to share some positive developments in the human rights situation in the Gambia following the last ordinary session held in the Gambia in October 2017, including the ratification by the Gambia of the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, the International Convention on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, the Second Optional Protocol to the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, and the Protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the establishment of an African Court on Human and People's Rights. He further stated that the Gambia is in the process of making a declaration pursuant to Article 34(6) of the Court Protocol to allow individuals and NGOs to have direct access to the court. Regarding ratification of the Second Optional Protocol, he indicated that the Gambia has adopted a moratorium on the application of death penalty as a first step towards abolition. The Vice President highlighted other areas of progress, including improved freedom of expression, the dramatic decline in arbitrary arrest and detention, increased public engagement and participation, commencement of a process to review repressive laws and establishment of Media Law Reform Committee, steps taken to reform various governance areas, establishment of a Constitutional Review Commission, establishment of a Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission, steps taken to establish a National Human Rights Commission, the drafting of an anti-corruption bill, improved prison conditions and review of the Prison Act to ensure compliance with international standards, development of various national policies, such as the National Development Plan 2018-2021, and the submission by the Gambia of its combined periodic report to the Commission covering a period of 24 years. The Vice President concluded by extending his appreciation to all participants for attending this session and declared the 63rd Ordinary Session of the Commission open. Honorable Commissioner Soyata Maiga chaired the 63rd Ordinary Session of the Commission. The 63rd Ordinary Session of the Commission was attended by a total of 690 delegates, including 154 delegates representing 27 state parties, namely Algeria, Angola, Botswana, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of Congo, Egypt, Eswatini, Ethiopia, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Kenya, Lesotho, Libya, Malawi, Mauritania, Nigeria, Rwanda, Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, Senegal, Sierra Leone, South Africa, South Sudan, Sudan, Togo, and Uganda. 11 representatives of AU institutions, 34 representatives of national human rights institutions, 5 representatives of international and intergovernmental organizations, 364 representatives of NGOs, 67 representatives of the media, 29 other observers, and 94 representing members of the Commission, the Secretariat, interpreters, translators, and support staff. The Commission launched the following documents and instruments during the 63rd Ordinary Session: Principles on Decriminalization of Petty Offenses in Africa, Compendium on the Legal Protection of Human Rights Defenders in Africa, Arabic and Portuguese versions of Guidelines on Access to Information and Elections in Africa, State Reporting Guidelines and Principles on Article 21 and 24 of the African Charter relating to extractive industries, human rights, and the environment, and newsletter of the Working Group on Extractive Industries, Human Rights, and the Environment in Africa. The Commission also organized the following panel discussions during the 63rd Ordinary Session: Panel on the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the State of Play in Africa. Panel on implementation of decisions of the Commission. Panel on the situation of migrants at risk of torture and other ill treatment in Africa, alternative approaches. Panel on the 20th anniversary of the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders and the 5th anniversary of the UN General Assembly Resolution 63/81 on women human rights defenders. Panel on state reporting obligations and guidelines to reporting under the Maputo Protocol. Panel on extrajudicial killing in Africa. Panel on persons with albinism, and panel on the guidelines on access to information and elections. Representatives of the following 18 state parties made statements on human rights situation in their respective countries: Algeria, Angola, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of Congo, Eswatini, Ethiopia, Kenya, Kingdom of Lesotho, Malawi, Islamic Republic of Mauritania, Rwanda, Saudi Arab Democratic Republic, South Africa, South Sudan, the Sudan, and Uganda. Representatives of the following 6 national human rights institutions also made statements on the human rights situations in their respective countries: the National Human Rights Commission of Cameroon, National Preventive Mechanism of Mauritania, Swahili National Commission on Human Rights, National Human Rights Commission of Niger, National Commission for Human Rights of Rwanda, and the Commission for Gender Equality of South Africa. A total of 61 NGOs with observer status with the Commission made statements on the human rights situation in Africa. A representative of the International Committee of the Red Cross also made a statement on the vulnerabilities of women and girls in situations of armed conflict and other situations of violence, underscoring the importance of adhering to the Maputo Protocol and international humanitarian law to better protect women and girls. The Commission reported on the status of its relationship and cooperation with national human rights institutions and NGOs. It gave an update on the status of submission of activity reports by national human rights institutions and NGOs, respectively. In accordance with its resolution on granting affiliate status to national human rights institutions in Africa, the Commission granted affiliate status to 1 national human rights institution, the South Sudan Human Rights Commission, bringing the total number of national human rights institutions with affiliate status with the Commission to 29. In accordance with its resolution on the criteria for granting and maintaining observer status to NGOs working on human rights in Africa, the Commission granted observer status to 1 NGO, Haki Africa, bringing the total number of NGOs with observer status with the Commission to 518. The Commission gave an update on the status of submission of state parties' periodic reports. In accordance with Article 62 of the African Charter and Article 26 of the Maputo Protocol, the Commission considered periodic reports of the following 3 state parties: 6th and 7th combined periodic report of the Republic of Angola on the African Charter and report on the Maputo Protocol, 6th and 7th and 8th combined report of the Republic of Togo on the African Charter and report on the Maputo Protocol, and the 2nd and 3rd combined periodic reports of the Republic of Botswana on the African Charter. In accordance with paragraph 25 of the peer review mechanism-based document, the chairperson of the African Peer Review Mechanism panel of eminent persons presented the African Peer Review Mechanism reports of the Republic of Chad, the Republic of Djibouti, and the Republic of Senegal. The following members of the Commission presented their intersession reports, highlighting activities undertaken in their capacities as commissioners and special mechanism mandate holders. the chairperson of the Commission and chairperson of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, Communities in Africa, the vice chairperson of the Commission and special rapporteur on freedom of expression and access to information in Africa, the special rapporteur on the rights of women in Africa, the special rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders in Africa, the special rapporteur on prisons, conditions of detention and policing in Africa, the special rapporteur on refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced persons and migrants in Africa, chairperson of the Working Group on Extractive Industries, Environment and Human Rights Violations in Africa, chairperson of the Working Group on Death Penalty and Extrajudicial Summary or Arbitrary Killings in Africa, chairperson of the Committee for the Prevention of Torture in Africa, chairperson of the Committee on the Protection of the Rights of People Living with HIV and those at risk, vulnerable to and affected by HIV, chairperson of the Working Group on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in Africa, chairperson of the Working Group on the Rights of Older Persons and People with Disabilities in Africa, and chairperson of the Working Group on Communications. The Commission adopted the reports of 3 human rights protection missions undertaken to the Republic of Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Islamic Republic of Mauritania. The Commission considered and adopted the following documents with amendments: concluding observations on the initial state report of Eritrea, draft protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the rights of citizens to social protection and social security, communication and media strategy of the Commission, report of the Audit on Communications, and a report of the second regional seminar on implementation. The Commission also considered and made observations on the following documents: draft general comment on Article 12.1 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, report of the Secretary to the Commission, 2019th annual work plan of the Commission, report on staff, budgetary and related matters, study on human rights in conflict situation in Africa, draft guidelines on referral of cases to the court, report of the meeting on validation of the AU study on policy coherence between the AUC and AU organs, proposals on the operationalization of the recommendation of on the code of conduct of the Commission, paper on recusal, concept note for regional consultation on combating racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other related intolerances, correspondence from the Coalition of African Lesbians on the request for the legal basis of the withdrawal of its observer status, and a proposal by NANRI on the establishment of an online information center on implementation of the Commission's decision. The Commission deferred consideration of the draft guidelines on the right to water. The Commission adopted the following 11 resolutions: resolution on the interpretive and protective mandate of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, resolution on the human rights situation in the Federal Republic of Somalia, resolution on the human rights situation in the Republic of Burundi, resolution on the continuing human rights violations in the Republic of Cameroon, resolution on the human rights situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo, resolution on the need for a study on the situation of Africa's sacred natural sites and territories, resolution on the need to undertake a study on human rights violations against migrants, resolution on the situation of women human rights defenders in Africa, resolution on the establishment of a support group for the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders and focal point on reprisals in Africa for the promotion and monitoring of effective implementation of the guidelines on freedom of assembly and association in Africa. A resolution on the elaboration of a general comment on Article 12.1 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and resolution on the expansion of the mandate and composition of the Working Group on Death Penalty, Extrajudicial, Summary, and Arbitrary Killings in Africa. The Commission considered 15 communications, 3 communications on admissibility, of which 1 was declared admissible and 2 were deferred, 9 communications on seizure, all of which were seized, 3 with provisional measures, 2 communications were struck out, and 1 communication on request for withdrawal, which was granted. The Commission further considered and provided guidance on 3 communications. Representatives of the African Peer Review Mechanism briefed the Commission on the expansion of the African Peer Review Mechanism's mandate to track the state of governance in Africa and propose collaborative activities between the mechanism and the Commission. The Advisory Committee on Budgetary and Staff Matters and the Working Group on Specific Issues met to consider performance and recruitment audit report, after which the Commission provided guidance. The Commission considered its 45th activity report, which will be presented to the 34th Ordinary Session of the AU Executive Council and the 32nd Ordinary Session of the AU Assembly of Heads of States and Governments. The Commission decided to hold its 25th Extraordinary Session from 19th February to 5th March 2019 in Banjul, the Gambia. The Commission decided to hold its 64th Ordinary Session from 24th April to 14th May 2019 in Cairo, Egypt. The Commission expresses its sincere gratitude to the government and people of the Gambia for the warm welcome and hospitality extended to participants and for providing necessary facilities which contributed to the successful conduct of the session. The closing ceremony of the 63rd Ordinary Session was held on the 13th November 2018 in Banjul, the Gambia. Dawn in Banjul, Republic of the Gambia, this day, 13th November 2018. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Honorable Commissioner Lucia Swagbo. It is now my singular honor and privilege to call upon the Vice Chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, Honorable Commissioner Lawrence Murugu Mute, to read his closing statement.
Honorable Abubakar Tambadou, Attorney General and Minister of Justice of the Republic of the Gambia, distinguished representatives of states parties to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, distinguished members of the Diplomatic and Consular Corps, distinguished representatives of national human rights institutions and civil society organizations, honorable colleagues, members of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. The 63rd Ordinary Session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights is coming to an end today. After 21 days of intense and fruitful deliberations by the Commission, and also between the Commission and yourselves, our stakeholders. This 63rd Ordinary Session has provided an opportune forum for debating, considering, and deciding on Africa's most notable human rights successes, as well as its most pressing challenges. From the outset, I wish to commend Angola, Botswana, and Togo for presenting their periodic reports before us in terms of Article 62 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and in respect of Angola and Togo, also in terms of Article 26 of the Protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, on the rights of women in Africa. I also wish to exhort the Commission's state and non-state stakeholders to make good use of the soft law instruments which we launched during this session, notably the principles on decriminalization of petty offenses in Africa, state reporting guidelines and principles on Article 21 and 24 of the African Charter relating to extractive industries, human rights, and the environment, and Arabic and Portuguese versions of the guidelines on access to information and elections in Africa. Distinguished delegates, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, during the public part of the session, many of you, state and non-state stakeholders, raised your deep concerns about the importance of ensuring the continued effective implementation of the critical work which the Commission plays in monitoring respect for human and people's rights in Africa. I, for example, recall the statement of the distinguished delegate of Burkina Faso, who stated his earnest conviction that the Commission is the best African forum for discussing human rights, and that it behoves states to engage robustly with the Commission. I also recall numerous statements by national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations which raised their deep concerns about the Commission's independence and autonomy. Distinguished delegates, in the course of the private part of this session, the Commission has continued to reflect deeply on the important functions which it plays. As commissioners, we recall that we made the solemn declaration to carry our duties well and faithfully in all impartiality. The African Charter establishes negative obligations as well as positive obligations, which all states should implement. By the necessary dictates of the African Charter, executing the Commission's mandate means that from time to time, we do call out states which in our assessment may be violating their obligations under the Charter. That is our remit. That is our responsibility, which we may not shirk. In this sense, the Charter does not allow us to stay quiet while Africa's children are kidnapped and held ransom by whomsoever. The Charter requires us to speak when sexual violence is meted out on Africa's women. We have no choice but to speak when a human being is hunted and killed for her organs, just because she has albinism. The Charter requires us to raise questions when the resources of Africa's people are pillaged, or when Africans are prohibited from expressing themselves or participating in politics, or when their rights to association or conscience are limited unfairly. The Charter requires us to make pronouncements to support the full exercise of economic, social, and cultural rights by Africans. And ladies and gentlemen, the Charter requires us to speak firmly when Africa's youth are killed extrajudicially, and indeed when torture is used under any circumstance, or when stigma, discrimination, or violence is perpetrated on an individual on account of their sexuality. Yet, distinguished delegates, it is also our responsibility and duty to affirm and support all states to ensure their better respect for human and people's rights. To affirm, never to negate, That is why we affirm states which ensure representation of women in political offices. That is why we commend states which implement free basic education and those that outlaw female genital mutilation, capital punishment, or indeed criminal defamation, or states that ensure equal opportunities for persons with disabilities. That is why, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the vision of the African Commission is an Africa characterized by respect for and observance of human rights, where the rights guaranteed by the Charter are known and advocated for by Africa's people, and promoted, protected, respected, and fulfilled by the state parties and African people. This vision resonates with the African Union's Agenda 2063, which aspires to an Africa of good governance, respect of human rights, justice, and the rule of law, a peaceful and secure Africa, a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development, and an Africa whose development is people-driven, relying on the potential of African and especially its women and youth, and caring for children. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, the protective mandate of the Commission is established in Article 45 of the Charter. The Charter enjoins us to use the communications procedure to adjudicate and provide redress to victims of human rights violations, whether those victims are individuals, groups, or indeed states. In the same vein, the interpretive mandate of the Commission, which again is established in Article 45 of the Charter, commands the Commission to formulate and lay down principles and rules aimed at solving legal problems relating to human and people's rights and fundamental freedoms upon which African governments may base their legislation. And so that is what we do. Distinguished delegates, the African Commission was established as Africa's principal human rights institution. To date, all members of the African Union, bar one, are party to the Charter. So the Commission's protective and interpretive mandates therefore reach the whole continent. I cannot overemphasize at this closing session the importance of the access which the Commission provides to Africa's citizens. Our quasi-judicial jurisdiction applies universally to all across the continent, thereby serving the aim of establishing a people-centered union. Hence, as we close this 63rd ordinary session, speaking on my own behalf and on behalf of the members of the Commission, our humble appeal and trust is that all parties to the Charter, and also indeed the policy organs of the African Union, will recommit to their cardinal obligation under the African Charter to give effect to the rights, freedoms, and duties enshrined in the African Charter. That state parties will continue respecting the normative standards and institutional frameworks established by the Charter, including by supporting the Commission to continue promoting, protecting, and interpreting the rights which are in the Charter. That they will continue supporting the complementarity relationship between the African Commission and the African Court on Human and People's Rights. And that states, parties, and policy organs of the Union will ensure that the ongoing reforms process of the Union preserves and enhances the independent, distinct, and specialized mandates of each organ while creating frameworks for improving their collaboration and effectiveness to strengthen the overall human rights and governance framework on the continent. Distinguished delegates, I may not conclude this statement without commending the South Sudan Human Rights Commission and Haki Africa for their grant by the Commission, respectively, of NHRI affiliate status and NGO accreditation. I wish to assure all our non-state stakeholders that the Commission's aspiration is to remain an inclusive and accessible organ where Africa's citizens and interlocutors may approach, dialogue, recommend, and indeed litigate. Again, that is what the Charter requires us to do. Distinguished delegates, I wish to thank all the delegates who participated in this ordinary session. I also wish to thank all the state and non-state stakeholders who have in any way engaged with the Commission during this past intersession. I also wish to appreciate very much the government and the people of the Gambia for hosting this session and indeed for hosting the Commission's headquarters. Indeed, Honorable Minister, we look forward to receiving you perhaps at the next session so that we can dialogue on your periodic report, which you have already submitted to us. Needless to say, the Commission, Honorable Minister, also looks forward to concrete steps towards the realization of the government's commitments to provide us with our very own permanent headquarters. I thank all the technicians and interpreters who have facilitated this session so well. Finally, I cannot complete this statement without acknowledging the commissioners, the Commission's chairperson, my colleagues, members of the Commission, and our very own true heroes and heroines, the hard-working staff of the Secretariat. I wish all of you well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Honorable Vice Chairperson, and thank you for your kind words to the Secretariat. It is now my honor and privilege to give the floor to Honorable Mr. Abubakar M. Tambadou, Attorney General and Minister of Justice of the Republic of the Gambia, to give his statement and to declare the 63rd Ordinary Session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights officially closed. Honorable Minister, you have the floor, sir.
Honorable Vice Chairperson and members of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic and Consular Corps, distinguished delegates of the African Union member states, distinguished representatives of international organizations, distinguished representatives of national human rights institutions, distinguished representatives of non-governmental and civil society organizations, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed with great honor and pleasure that I deliver these closing remarks at the 63rd Ordinary Session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. First, allow me to extend the felicitations of His Excellency, the President of the Republic of the Gambia, Mr. Adama Barrow, and the government and people of the Gambia for another successful session of the Commission. I am informed that during the course of this session, you had very thought-provoking and stimulating discussions on topical human rights issues in our continent. I wish to extend my sincere gratitude to all those who attended and made this session a success. I thank you for coming in your numbers and for demonstrating your unwavering commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights in our continent. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the African Commission has once again provided the platform for states parties, NGOs, and human rights bodies to meet and evaluate the status of implementation of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, among others. These sessions provide an opportunity for states parties to take stock of their progress and opportunities on the protection and promotion of human rights, and to be proud of their achievements, while at the same time underscoring the various areas that still need improvement. The final communiqué read out earlier is a strong indicator of the magnitude of work achieved so far by our collective efforts and the people of Africa through this commission. The pertinent human rights issues discussed and deliberated on during the session, the recommendations and observations of the Commission, as well as the concerns raised by civil society organizations and human rights bodies, are all geared towards strengthening our resolve to protect the basic human rights of our citizens. The state reports considered and the constructive dialogue that followed exemplifies not only the important role played by the Commission on issues affecting Africa's development, but also reflects the enthusiasm and desire of all stakeholders here present, including state parties and non-state actors, to work together for the realization of the ideals of the Banjul Charter. In this vein, I wish to congratulate all the states whose reports have been reviewed during this session. I equally take this opportunity to call on other states to submit their state periodic reports when due in fulfillment of their obligation under the Charter. On our part, the government of the Gambia looks forward to a fruitful engagement with the Commission on our combined report, which we recently submitted for the first time in 24 years, and which further demonstrates a new political will on human rights in the Gambia. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I wish to congratulate further the Commission and its Secretariat on the successful completion of yet another session. I take this opportunity to commend their challenging but noble and rewarding efforts and their tireless engagements with states to ensure that the protection and promotion of all human rights becomes a reality in Africa. This therefore gives me the pleasure to reiterate the support of the government of the Gambia to the work of the Commission. To you, Mr. Vice Chairperson, and the Commissioners, we say, you are a proud face of the African continent, and we should all strive to preserve your legacy by continuing to empower and not undermine you. Let me further seize this opportunity to acknowledge and commend the tremendous efforts made by the government of the Gambia through the Ministry of Justice and all other government institutions who have in one way or the other provided support in ensuring the successful hosting of this session. Finally, I hope that all participants have enjoyed their stay in the Gambia and took time off to explore the smiling coast of Africa. I wish you all a safe journey back home and look forward to welcoming you to another session of the Commission in the Gambia again soon. With these few remarks, it is now my singular honor to declare this 63rd Ordinary Session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights officially closed. I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Honorable Attorney General. That brings us to the end of the closing ceremony of the 63rd Ordinary Session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights.
you.